It began with silence. No headlines, no grand ceremony, no Western cameras rolling, just a brief announcement on national radio. Burkina Faso has paid off its domestic debt $4.79 billion. At first, even the announcer's voice trembled, unsure if the words were real. Because in today's world, no one expects an African nation, especially not a landlocked, war-torn country like Burkina Faso, to declare itself debt-free without the blessing of the IMF or the World Bank. But this time, the narrative changed. For decades, Africa's story was written by others' aid donors, creditors, consultants, and policymakers sitting in offices thousands of miles away. They told Africans what was possible, what was realistic, and what wasn't. And yet, in 2024, Burkina Faso did what those experts said was impossible. It didn't just pay back billions in domestic debt. It did so without borrowing a single dollar from Western institutions. It was more than an economic act. It was an act of rebellion. Across the Sahel, the news spread like wildfire. Radios crackled in dusty markets, and people stopped mid-conversation to ask, "Did you hear? We did ourselves." For the first time in years, the words sovereignty, independence, and freedom weren't just slogans, they were balance sheet realities. But how did this happen? How did a country long written off as a financial underdog, one plagued by terrorism, drought, and political instability, suddenly pull off one of the most astonishing economic recoveries of the 21st century? To understand this story, you have to understand the system Burkina Faso walked away from. For years, Western institutions like the IMF and World Bank sold Africa a particular dream, the dream of development through debt. Loans came with smiles and conditions. Grants came with rules, and assistance often meant dependency. Countries were told that without external credit, they couldn't grow. Without IMF approval, investors would flee. And without foreign aid, their people would starve. It was a story repeated so often that even local governments started to believe it. But one government did not anymore. In the months leading up to 2024, Burkina Faso's leadership began to quietly audit every cent of its national debt. They discovered something shocking. Nearly 70% of it was owed not to foreign banks, but to domestic creditors, local businesses, pension funds, civil servants, and small-scale investors who had lent to their own government. These weren't faceless lenders from Washington or Brussels. They were Burkinabe farmers, teachers, soldiers, and shop owners who had been waiting years to be repaid. That discovery changed everything. The government decided that before paying anyone else, before negotiating with any global institution, it would pay its own people first. This decision marked the beginning of what economists would later call the Burkina model, a radical inversion of economic orthodoxy that prioritized citizens over creditors, sovereignty over approval ratings, and production over dependence. The move was bold, almost reckless in the eyes of global analysts. After all, Burkina Faso's GDP was barely $20 billion. Repaying nearly a quarter of that amount in a single fiscal cycle seemed suicidal. But behind closed doors, a plan was forming, one built on three pillars: local mobilization, resource monetization, and fiscal sovereignty. The first pillar was local mobilization. Instead of foreign credit, Burkina Faso turned to its people literally. Citizens were encouraged to buy into national bonds that offered returns tied to local projects, irrigation systems, gold refineries, textile plants, and renewable energy farms. For the first time, economic participation wasn't abstract, it was personal. Families could point to a bridge or factory and say, "We built that and we own part of it." Within months, billions of CFA francs began flowing into domestic accounts. The second pillar was resource monetization. Burkina Faso sits atop vast natural wealth: gold, manganese, zinc, limestone. But for decades, most of these resources were extracted by foreign companies, exported raw and taxed minimally. In 2023, that changed. The government introduced a sovereign resource dividend, mandating that 25% of all mining profits remain in country and flow directly into a development fund. This fund was not managed by the IMF, nor was it supervised by Western auditors. It was overseen by a new institution, the National Economic Council, made up of citizens, economists, soldiers, and workers' unions. The third pillar was fiscal sovereignty. Burkina Faso, rejected the old idea that economic credibility required foreign validation. Instead of pegging reforms to IMF recommendations, they benchmarked success to food security, industrial output, and employment rates. And the results came fast. In 2024 alone, local agricultural production rose by 18%. Gold revenue doubled after stricter export controls. Domestic industries, particularly in textiles and construction, began hiring at record rates. The economy, long stagnant, was finally breathing again. Still, outside observers remained skeptical. Western analysts dismissed the recovery as temporary populism. Think tanks warned of structural imbalance. Yet, as one African economist from Ghana noted, temporary populism that pays your bills is better than permanent dependency that buries your future. By the end of the year, Burkina Faso's government announced what no one thought possible. Every cent of its $4.79 billion in domestic debt had been cleared through revenue, not loans. It was a turning point not just for the country, but for the entire continent. For too long, Africa's greatest exports have been raw materials and compliance. But now, Burkina Faso was exporting something new, an idea that sovereignty is not a slogan, that independence is not celebrated one day a year, but lived every day in policy, production, and principle. And that freedom, real freedom, begins when you no longer owe anyone else for your own survival. Before one can understand what happened in 2024, one must first understand a land that made it possible, a country once called Upper Volta, now known proudly as Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. This name is not a slogan. It is a mirror of character. It speaks of a people who have carried hardship like a banner and turned endurance into identity. Centuries before colonization, the territory that would become Burkina Faso was a crossroads of civilizations. The mossy kingdoms rose on its central plateau, building systems of governance rooted in accountability and duty long before the modern state existed. Chiefs ruled not by decree but by consensus. Even enemies were treated with a kind of reluctant respect, a moral code that would survive empires, wars, and occupations. Then came the French in the late 19th century, carving the region into administrative blocks, drawing borders that split tribes and fused rival clans. They called it Haute Volta, Upper Volta, a name chosen not for its people but for a river. Under colonial rule, men were conscripted to dig, build, and bleed for projects they would never own. Cotton and gold flowed outward. Hunger and exhaustion stayed behind. Independence arrived in 1960, not as liberation, but as inheritance of a broken machine. The nation's first decades were marked by military coups, ideological experiments, and a fragile search for direction. Each new regime promised renewal, yet foreign influence lingered like a shadow over every decision. And then in 1983, a young captain named Thomas Sankara appeared, a man who spoke of dignity, self-reliance, and the right of Africans to write their own future. He renamed the country Burkina Faso and launched a revolution of simplicity. Plant trees, educate women, refuse foreign luxury. He banned Mercedes-Benz cars from ministers, vaccinated millions, and urged farmers to feed their own people. For 4 brief years, the world witnessed what African independence could look like. But in 1987, bullets ended his life and buried a dream, or so it seemed. The decades that followed oscillated between hope and hardship. Corruption took root. Drought struck mercilessly. Terrorist groups crept southward from the Sahara. Ordinary Burkinabe people, farmers, traders, herders, and teachers endured without complaint. Their wealth was in music, community, and faith. The rhythm of the balafon, the call of the muezzin, and the laughter of markets held the country together when politics threatened to tear it apart. By the early 2000s, Burkina Faso had become one of the poorest nations on earth. GDP per capita hovered under $1,000. Literacy rates lagged behind global averages. Rural poverty surpassed 40%. Yet even in poverty, the nation carried an unusual sense of moral wealth. Neighbors shared meals when food was scarce. Communities rebuilt homes after floods without waiting for government aid. It was this social fabric, humble, self-sustaining, unyielding, that would later allow the country to face the unimaginable, paying off billions in debt without outside help. Politically, instability persisted. Coups came and went, each one claiming to rescue the nation from chaos. The army, though small, became a mirror of society disciplined yet divided. Extremist violence spilled across borders from Mali and Niger, forcing villages to choose between silence and resistance. Over 2 million citizens were displaced, and through all of it, foreign troops and contractors moved in under the banner of security assistance, while gold exports and aid money quietly left the country. To understand why the repayment of $4.79 billion was revolutionary, you must see it against this backdrop: a nation that had been told it would never stand on its own, that its future was forever tied to the benevolence of others. Burkina Faso's cultural DNA is woven from self-help. In rural communities, when a house collapses, no one asks who owns it. Everyone helps rebuild. When a harvest fails, neighbors gather grain for the family in need. That same ethic of collective responsibility began to seep into governance when new leaders started asking, what if the same principle could rebuild an economy? Education campaigns spread through radio, urging citizens to invest in local bonds rather than hoard savings. Market women in Ouagadougou, gold miners in Yako, and shepherds in Djibo all contributed to the nation's new economic instruments, microbonds, that would eventually fund infrastructure and pay domestic creditors. It was a spirit of community translated into finance. But the story of modern Burkina Faso cannot be told without acknowledging its trials. Crime and smuggling networks, often fueled by desperation, link parts of the Sahel in a web of survival economies. Terror attacks targeted schools, churches, and mosques alike, trying to divide communities that had coexisted for centuries. Each tragedy was followed by funerals filled not with despair, but with hymns, because resignation is not part of Burkinabe vocabulary. When Ibrahim Traoré rose to leadership, he inherited a country both exhausted and unbreakable. He found a people who had buried heroes, survived betrayals, and still believed in tomorrow. That is why, when his government began speaking of economic independence, it did not sound like propaganda. It sounded like the return of a long-lost promise. Culture, history, and politics converged into a single moment of defiance. The same hands that once built colonial roads now till cooperative farms. The same youth who once sought migration began working in local initiatives to process gold and cotton domestically. And the same songs that once mourned oppression began to celebrate possibility. Burkina Faso's debt repayment was therefore not merely an accounting achievement. It was a cultural statement. It declared that a nation shaped by centuries of humility could still teach the world about strength. It reminded observers that progress is not always loud. Sometimes it hums in the rhythm of drums and the discipline of a farmer who refuses to give up. And so, when the announcement finally came that $4.79 billion in domestic debt had been cleared, the shock was not in the number itself, but in the method. No IMF bailout, no international applause, no press release drafted in Washington or Paris. Just quiet pride. That pride did not emerge overnight. It was born of decades of endurance. The same endurance that allowed Burkina Faso to survive colonization, coups, and terror. The world saw a financial headline. The Burkinabe saw a generational victory. And so when Traoré's government stood before the nation and declared the debt erased, it was more than a policy milestone. It was a culmination of an entire people's history. A century of struggle, song, and sacrifice have finally converged into one line of defiance. We can stand alone. It is easy to dismiss what Burkina Faso achieved as a mere financial adjustment, a tightening of belts, a temporary policy correction. But that is not what happened here. What happened was ideological. What happened was a paradigm shift. For decades, Africa's financial narrative was written in the boardrooms of Washington, Paris, and Brussels. But in 2024, that script was rewritten in Ouagadougou. The core message was simple yet revolutionary. True independence begins when a nation takes responsibility for its own economic destiny. The first major reform under Ibrahim Traoré's transitional government was a complete restructuring of fiscal governance. They began by auditing every layer of government expenditure from ministries to local councils, exposing decades of mismanagement and corruption that had quietly drained the country's resources. Funds once hidden under bureaucratic shadows were brought to light. Every unnecessary contract, every inflated procurement, and every external dependency was questioned. Burkina Faso was not just saving money, it was reclaiming its sovereignty from within. At the same time, the leadership implemented one of the most aggressive domestic mobilization strategies in modern African economic history. Instead of waiting for external donors to dictate priorities, the government appealed directly to its citizens and local enterprises. They encouraged citizens to invest in national bonds, redirect savings into local cooperative banks, and build community ownership in national projects. It was not charity, it was partnership. The government offered transparency, and in return, the people offered trust. But the most transformative aspect of this movement wasn't financial, it was psychological. For too long, African societies have been told that progress can only come through foreign approval, that you need aid to build roads, loans to develop schools, and external validation to define success. Traoré shattered that illusion. He told his people that no external savior was coming, that the nation's dignity lay in its own hands. This was more than economics. It was the rebirth of self-worth. The numbers began to tell their own story. As state expenditure tightened and internal revenue collection improved, Burkina Faso managed to redirect funds from foreign debt servicing into domestic development. Agricultural subsidies were restructured to favor smallholders instead of foreign corporations. Local industries, from textile cooperatives to mining ventures, were renationalized or brought under joint ownership with Burkinabe investors. The government actively discouraged the export of raw resources at low prices, instead investing in local processing and value addition. If gold leaves our soil, it must leave as finished jewelry, not dust, one minister declared. Of course, the international community was not pleased. Western financial institutions, accustomed to having Africa's fiscal decisions passed through their approval filters, suddenly found themselves bypassed. Their analysts called it unsustainable, populist, even dangerous. Yet, as the month unfolded, the results spoke louder than criticism. Inflation stabilized, civil servants were paid on time, and the government managed to clear nearly $4.79 billion in internal debt without printing excess money, without IMF credit lines, and without begging for mercy. Still, the journey was not without resistance. Traoré's administration faced relentless economic and political pressure. Certain multinational interests attempted to destabilize the progress by freezing trade agreements and threatening embargoes. Some local elites, long benefiting from foreign dependency, resisted reforms that demanded transparency and accountability. But the government stood firm. Our poverty is not natural, Traoré once said. It is engineered by a system that feeds on our submission. Those words echoed across Africa. And indeed, the continent was watching. From Dakar to Kinshasa, from Bamako to Harare, young Africans began to question the long-standing dependency model. They started to see that aid, in its modern form, was rarely about generosity, it was about control. Every loan came with conditions. Liberalize your markets, privatize your industries, open your land. But Burkina Faso's move was a defiance of this unwritten colonial contract. It was the first domino in a larger resistance movement against what Traoré termed economic colonialism. The success of the debt repayment inspired new discussions across Africa about financial autonomy. If Burkina Faso, a country with limited natural resources, under security threat, and isolated by global institutions, could achieve this, what excuse did larger, wealthier African nations have? The myth that independence ends at the flag-raising ceremony was finally being dismantled. Real independence, as Traoré emphasized, begins when a nation feeds itself, funds itself, and governs itself without external permission. This ideological stance brought Burkina Faso closer to its regional allies Mali, Niger, and Guinea, forming what came to be known as the Alliance of Sahel States, AS. Together, they began reimagining a new economic order, one that rejected exploitative trade deals, foreign military interference, and externally imposed economic models. This alliance wasn't born out of hostility toward the West, but rather from a desire for balance, for dignity. It was Africa saying, we will engage with the world, but on our own terms. And perhaps the most profound impact of this entire movement was on Africa's youth. For decades, young Africans were taught to dream of leaving to cross deserts and seas in search of opportunities that their own lands supposedly lacked. But in 2024, for the first time in a long while, many began to look inward. They saw a leader who looked like them, spoke like them, and refused to bow to powers that treated Africa as an economic afterthought. Ibrahim Traoré became more than a head of state. He became a symbol of possibility. Burkina Faso's financial revolution was not built on miracles. It was built on discipline, courage, and unity. The country cut extravagant government spending, redirected military budgets toward agriculture and education, and promoted local production of essential goods. Imported luxury vehicles were replaced with locally assembled ones. National pride was no longer theoretical. It was practiced through every policy decision. The result? A small nation that once depended on donors began to set the example for self-reliance. But what makes this story truly remarkable is how it connects to the larger African struggle. Because the $4.79 billion repayment is not just a Burkinabe victory, it's an African statement. It tells the world that Africa can pay its own debts, manage its own affairs, and build its own future without being tethered to external approval. It's a challenge to the narrative that Africa must always borrow, that Africans are incapable of managing their own destiny. In global financial history, this moment will be remembered as a turning point not because of the number itself, but because of what it represented. It was a declaration that Africa's liberation in the 21st century would not come from revolutions or wars, but from economic sovereignty. And while critics continue to doubt, the people of Burkina Faso continue to live proof that dignity is a far greater resource than gold. But as history has shown, every act of defiance against the global order comes with a cost. For Burkina Faso, the cost was isolation, economic, diplomatic, and media-driven. International headlines painted the nation as rogue, its leadership as radical, and its decisions as dangerous experiments. Financial institutions quietly adjusted risk ratings, discouraging investors from entering the Burkinabe market. Aid agencies reduced cooperation programs. Western media rarely covered a repayment story, and when they did, it was with skepticism, not admiration. Yet the silence of the powerful only amplified the voice of the people. Across Africa, Traoré's name became synonymous with courage, not the courage of a soldier in battle, but the courage of a leader willing to break invisible chains. Young Africans began quoting his words, painting murals of him in cities from Lagos to Nairobi. His message that freedom is incomplete without financial sovereignty resonated far beyond the borders of Sahel. What truly startled the world was not the speech or the announcement of repayment. It was the confidence with which the message was delivered. "We owe nothing to those who built their empires on our poverty," Traoré declared. "The debt is not ours. The debt is theirs to history, to justice, and to humanity." In those words, the balance of moral authority shifted. For centuries, Africa was told to apologize for being poor, to beg for compassion, to justify its own existence in the global economy. But in that moment, the roles reversed. The accuser became the accused. Burkina Faso's story sparked conversations in parliaments, universities, and cafes across the continent. Some leaders praised the achievement quietly. Others feared openly, because what Traoré had done was expose the truth that many governments were unwilling to face. Africa's debt crisis is not a financial problem, it is a political design. It is a system that thrives on dependency. The interest payment extracted from African nations every year are not about economics. They are instruments of control. For the first time in decades, Africa had a government saying no, not with violence, not with rhetoric, but with results. And that no echoed louder than any revolution. It told the IMF that Africa has alternatives. It told the World Bank that African nations can function outside their frameworks. It told the world that the human spirit, once awakened, cannot be silenced by debt contracts or diplomatic threats. As analysts try to understand the mechanics behind the success, they discover the simple truth at its core: unity. Burkina Faso's achievement was not a product of genius economists or secret resources. It was a result of leadership that trusted its people more than it feared the world. When the citizens believe that their government serves them, not foreign masters, they become the true power behind national transformation. And yet, Traoré's message extended beyond economics. It was a moral question, one that asked the world to confront its own hypocrisy. How can those who profited from colonization lecture Africa about debt? How can those who extract Africa's minerals at unfair prices speak of aid? How can justice exist in a world where those who owe reparations demand repayment? Burkina Faso's defiance was not an act of hostility toward the West. It was a plea for fairness. It was a call to dismantle the invisible empire that still governs African economies through numbers and signatures instead of chains and guns. It was a reminder that dignity cannot be borrowed and that sovereignty cannot be negotiated. And perhaps that is why this story continues to inspire millions. Because it is not only about Burkina Faso, it is about every nation, every community, every individual who has ever been told they are too small to make a difference. It is about reclaiming the narrative of possibility. In every African capital, a quiet awakening is taking place. People are beginning to ask new questions. What if we stop exporting raw materials and start processing them at home? What if we build our own digital infrastructure, our own defense systems, our own universities of innovation? What if, instead of competing for foreign aid, African nations competed for self-sufficiency? These are not fantasies anymore. They are the inevitable conversations of a generation that refuses to inherit the fear of its predecessors. Ibrahim Traoré's leadership has shown that it is not enough to demand respect, one must demonstrate it through action. Respect is built when a nation pays its workers, educates its children, and funds its future without waiting for external approval. It is built when the people stand tall, even when the world expects them to kneel. And make no mistake, the world is watching. Every act of independence in Africa shifts the global balance, challenges old alliances, and redefines what it means to be a developing nation. Because if Burkina Faso can repay billions in debt without external help, then the myth of African dependency begins to crumble. That myth is what has kept continents unequal, trade unfair, and justice unfinished. In the end, this story is not about numbers, it is about principles. It is about a small nation that dared to believe that liberation is incomplete until it is economic. It is about leadership that understood that freedom is not proclaimed once, but practiced daily through sacrifice, courage, and unity. As history will record, Burkina Faso may have been small in size, but in 2024, it became a giant in dignity. And long after the numbers fade, long after the critics change their tune, one truth will remain: that a nation which stands by its people can withstand any empire. So as we close this chapter, the question that remains is not whether Burkina Faso succeeded, but whether the rest of Africa is ready to follow. Because what Traoré began is not just a policy, it is a movement. It is a declaration that the time for excuses is ended, and the time for ownership has begun. To every young African watching this, your nation's wealth is not in foreign loans, it's in your hands. Your land, your ideas, your unity. To every leader, history will not remember how much you borrowed, but how much you built. And to the world, Africa is not asking for permission anymore. It is writing its own destiny in its own language, with its own pen and on its own terms. Because true independence is not declared, it is demonstrated. And in 2024, Burkina Faso demonstrated it to the world.